Our second speaker is John Myles, as an Emeritus Professor of Sociology and Senior Fellow in the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Until 2012, he was Canada Research Chair in the Social Foundations of Public Policy and for many years Senior Visiting Scholar at Statistics Canada. He's written widely on comparative politics of the welfare state and on topics related to income. So it's admirably suited for today's topic. And his recent publication, which I would highly recommend, is Inequality and the Fading of Redistributive Politics.
What I'm going to talk about this morning is very similar to what Armin was talking about last night, but without the charisma. So first, I'm going to give a bit of a preamble about the changes in income distribution in Canada, and then move on to some of the problems in addressing those changes. So a little over a decade ago, in fact, Armin and I had lunch together, and we were bemoaning the fact that we couldn't pitch a story about rising income inequality in Canada unless we reframed it as a poverty story. And all that has changed, mainly after the Occupy movement of 2011. By the 2015 election, inequality took over, and anti-poverty talk virtually disappeared from our national discourse. If you search through the policy platforms of the main parties in 2015, you will search almost in vain for the word poverty. And the data show why. So you all know this, but these are just a couple slides to capture the main points. So the basic story in this chart is that since 1980, almost all of the income growth in Canada has gone to the top 10%, and most of that to the top 1%. The next two charts tell us that while inequality was on the rise, poverty rates were either stable, as measured by the low income measure, or declining, using the LICO. Now, despite this shift in public attention, our policy elites' reaction to the new inequality has been pretty tepid. No one talks about launching a war on inequality, similar, say, to the war on poverty, no one. Or getting our national Gini coefficient back to 1980 levels. No one talks about that. Instead, the attention has turned to, all of this has been reframed, not in terms of inequality or of poverty, but rather to some of the data that Maria was showing about wage stagnation in the middle class. And so the new language is targeting the struggling middle class and those aspiring to join it. Those aspiring to join it is our new term for poverty.
Yeah.
So what are we going to do about this? What have governments tried to do? And during the last 10 years, I did a lot of work with a colleague on Canadian politics. I'm basically a comparativist, but in the last decade, I looked a little more closely at Canada. And two features that, to me, severely inhibit our national capacity to deal with these issues attracted my attention. I'm not going to claim these are the only issues. The first one, and I'm only going to touch on this, I'm not going to speak about it, is federalism. The prescriptive writing on social policy of the past 2 decades, going back to the 90s really, has highlighted the importance of education, especially early childhood education, labor market training, and labor market policies. Now, these are policy domains over which Ottawa has little or no control. So our federalism in that sense is a huge inhibitor to our ability to address the kinds of issues that we're facing. Now, if you can't do much about labor markets, and hence take-home pay, the wage problem that Mario alluded to, what's the alternative? All of the parties have figured this one out. You can give people the equivalent of a pay raise by offering them a tax cut. The Harper government cut the GST, and the Trudeau government handed out the so-called middle-class tax cut. And tax cuts, again, are the leading items on the agenda for this year's election. So my message today is going to be what Bob Kuttner in his book signaled as the huge problem that Mondale faced in 1984 when he was nominated to be the Democratic candidate. He said, "I'm going to raise taxes," and he promptly lost the election. Well, my party is probably going to run into the same kind of problem. On the right, taxation has always had bad press. On the left, raising taxes on the rich is popular, but so-called regressive taxes, like payroll and sales taxes, are usually held in bad odor. And I'm going to argue it's time to change our views on both fronts about levels of taxation and about forms of taxation. Progressives in the audience should not, it's time to raise taxes, and in a globalized world, particularly in a globalized world, we need to rely on payroll and sales taxes. Both are flat rate, hence regressive. Now, progressives in here should not get upset by this claim. That's exactly what small, open economies like those in Scandinavia have been doing for decades. The comparative evidence is pretty conclusive. Higher levels of taxation are a necessary, if not sufficient, condition for reducing both inequality and poverty. And getting high levels of taxation probably means we have to abandon our fears of so-called regressive taxes. To make my points, I'm going to ask you to look at the following chart and meditate on it during the rest of my talk. This is a chart that I got from a colleague in Boston who Bob might know, Kathy Jo Martin. Look first at the vertical y-axis. The first chart shows the level of government revenue as a share of GDP. The y-axis in the second chart shows the share of GDP that is given to social spending. We'll talk about the x-axis in a minute. Think about the y-axis as a measure of the level of government revenue as an indicator of national capacity for decommodification. If you want early childhood education, if you want to solve the housing problem, if you want to deal with public transport, right, governments need money. Right? You're going to have to pay for it. Where does the money come from? Right? And that should be the key question we should be putting to all of our political leaders for all of their suggestions. Where does the money come from? The second y-axis shows it's kind of a tautology, I suppose, but not quite. You could have high levels of government revenue and be spending it to buy tanks and guns, or you could be spending it to buy prisons. But it turns out, not surprisingly, that countries with high levels of government revenue also have high levels of social spending. Wow, that's great to learn, isn't it? And this chart is a little bit out of date, but this shows that Canada has somewhat higher social spending than the United States. By 2017, that was not true. Our percentage of GDP on that we give over to social spending is now lower than in the United States. I think we do a better job at spending it, but that's another point. The x-axis tells the more interesting story for this audience, I think, and maybe something to keep Canadian progressives awake at night. It measures the progressivity of the tax system, the relative shares of the rich and poor in funding the state. In effect, who pays? Did you know that the US has the most progressive tax system in the OECD? The most progressive tax system in the OECD. And Canada is not far behind. Denmark and Sweden, in contrast, have the most regressive tax systems. Scandinavians do tax the rich, of course, but mostly Scandinavian workers pay for themselves. How does this happen? It mainly has to do with the tax mix. Low tax countries like Canada and the United States rely heavily on progressive income taxes to generate revenue. Right? When we talk about making our tax system, expanding taxes, people automatically think about income taxes. And that's because we rely a great deal on income taxes. The US, for example, gets 41%, and Canada gets 37% of tax revenues from income taxes. The OECD average is 24%. High tax countries like Sweden and Denmark rely more on flat rate payroll and consumption taxes. Shouldn't progressives be in favor of progressive taxes and against regressive ones? The answer is that the taxation structure is almost irrelevant for the progressive agenda. Almost all redistribution takes place on the spending side, yes, not on the revenue side. Right. Lane Kenworthy has demonstrated this very nicely. He shows that the progressivity in taxation systems matters a little bit for inequality, but not very much. What matters most is the quantity of tax revenue, how much taxes the state is able to bring in, rather than the progressivity of the tax mix. The reason we get it wrong is that we don't really have good measures of net redistribution, the distribution of taxes minus expenditures. For the most part, we simply don't know how to do that. What we do know is that things like poverty and income inequality are not empirically related to the progressivity of the tax structure. So my main conclusion from all this is that while not a sufficient condition, higher government revenue in low-tax countries like Canada are a necessary condition for reducing inequality and poverty. We seem to be going in the opposite direction. According to the OECD, tax revenues in Canada fell from about 35% to 32% of GDP between 2000 and 2017. It's instructive to go back and read the mandate letters that Justin Trudeau sent to his ministers in 2015. They're filled with ambitious redistributive goals, but nowhere could I discover where the extra revenue for these initiatives would come from. And I once put this question to the principal author of these letters, and he respectfully declined to answer. As we head into a federal election, this is the question we need to put to all the candidates. The very same question, however, has to be put to candidates promising tax cuts. I'd love a tax cut, but how exactly will we pay for it? We seem to think that tax cuts are free, right? But every tax cut needs a reduction in expenditure somewhere in the system. You've got to pay for it somehow. All households, all families know this. If the family's income goes down, somewhere there's going to be some cutbacks. So, should we tax the rich? That's a good idea. They can seriously afford it after what we've seen happen to them in the past couple of decades. And Lars Osberg has estimated that a 65% marginal rate on incomes over $205,000 would add between $15 and $20 billion to the government coffers without inflicting meaningful social or economic damage on the Canadian economy. And this is in line with pretty mainline economic estimates from the states as well. $15 to $20 billion, by the way, would sort of more or less offset the cost of Harper's cut to the GST. Now, as Lars points out, the probability of moving to a 65% rate anytime soon is 0. And I agree. But I think his point is that we shouldn't be worried too much about raising top marginal rates. Nothing terrible will happen. My concern, however, is that whether raising taxes on the top 1% or even top 10% will move us closer to Denmark and Sweden. Will it enhance our capacity to decommodify, right? To provide daycare, early childhood learning, solve the housing crisis, so on and so forth. Deal with the environmental issues, which are all going to cost a lot of money. Raising rates on top earners, unfortunately, is not going to move the dial on income inequality very much. Nor will it provide the revenues required to do all the good stuff that needs doing. $15 to $20 billion is not to be sneezed at, but as Lars points out, it does not represent a fundamental change to a federal tax budget of some $280 billion. So yes, we should go there, but that's not going to deal with our problem. That's not going to shift us up that gradient very much. The historical narrative underlying Scandinavian social democracy was never a Robin Hood narrative. Rob the rich to feed the poor. Rather, it was a narrative of social solidarity. We look after one another. In an era of globalization, there is a terribly pragmatic side to this narrative. As Peter Lindert pointed out over a decade ago, the high-tax countries got there by taxing non-mobile factors of production, i.e. labor. The big revenue raisers in high-tax countries since the 60s have been value-added and payroll contributions. As Cato demonstrates, resistance to welfare retrenchment and globalization have been dependent upon the state's funding capacities. And state funding capacities in an era of globalization have been strongly related to payroll and especially consumption taxes, while income and corporate taxes have eroded. And just to think about that, the flatness of wage growth in Canada, or growing wage inequality in Canada or the United States, takes on a very different meaning when a lot of the economy has been decommodified. I mean, the good example is the healthcare issue. It makes a big difference just between Canada and the US. If you lose your job in Canada, you haven't lost your health insurance. Right? The big crisis of health insurance in the United States, or for unemployment and growing inequality, is the loss of health insurance, right? Is it too late for Canada? Cato also points out that the countries that moved earlier towards the payroll and VAT taxes did it in a way that was intended to provide new benefits and services and were recognized as such. Right? The latecomers like Canada, Australia, and Japan, and New Zealand to the VAT instead introduced the VAT as a mechanism for deficit reduction. Not a really popular electoral strategy. Is it too late for us? Perhaps not. Both Paul Martin and Justin Trudeau introduced significant increases in payroll taxes to finance the Canada pension plan. And they were widely lauded for this. In other words, you raise taxes, but people could see they were getting something for it. And as I demonstrated 2 decades ago, the maturation of the Canada pension plan in the 80s and 90s, not the guaranteed income supplement, was the main driver of the huge reduction in old age poverty over the period. Would Canadians be prepared to accept an increase in the HST in exchange for a national pharmacare program? The problem here is not like that of Medicare for all in the United States. My proposal is we should try. Thanks very much. Back to you.